Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Executive Director of the Linux Foundation, Jim Zemlin.
Wow. Are we back? Kind of back? Oh my gosh. We really missed you at the Linux Foundation, and I personally missed all of you. It is so good to see all your smiling faces. I could just keep going like this. Like if you don't laugh about it, you almost have to cry. But I want to welcome everyone, both virtually and here physically. It is really great to be back. We're so grateful to be here with all of you again. It has been a tough almost 2 years, and we have lots and lots to talk about. But it really, I think this is the beginning of hopefully a come back to being able to see everyone in person once again. I want to thank all of you who traveled here and again joined us. And I also want to thank the program chairs and committee chairs who helped with this event. I'm not going to go through and read all of these names, but you know who you are, and we're really grateful. You know, this is also our first hybrid physical and virtual event, and a lot of planning and time and effort go into creating these events, and I really want to thank this huge community. This is the second list of people who've been participating in planning for this event. I also want to thank our sponsors. We could not do it without you. You know, as the pandemic hit, we had to unwind all of our events. It was a very difficult time for our event team, very stressful time for all of us. And it really goes to show you how great this community is, that, you know, not only were we able to keep our entire team intact and they're back, and, you know, you see them here today facilitating this event, but also our sponsors stuck with us as well, and we're really grateful. Our diamond sponsors, Google, IBM, Microsoft, and Red Hat. We really appreciate your support. Also the platinum sponsors for this event, Huawei, Oracle, Sneak, Sonatype, SUSE. We really, really appreciate it. Please go say hi to them. We have a sponsor showcase located on level 3 of the building, so please head on down there. In addition, I have a few housekeeping announcements. The Wi-Fi schedule, mobile app, evening event details are on the back of your badge. We also have a code of conduct, so please adhere to that. Everyone should feel welcome and included. If you have any issues or you witness anything, please talk to our staff right away. And then please follow the health and safety protocols that we've set up today. The team did just an amazing job to make sure that all of you can feel safe at this event, that we've really adhered to a strict set of safety protocols, so please help us and cooperate with those protocols. Really appreciate it. We have a few announcements this morning. First is we've released our annual open source jobs report. Just this last week it was released, and we're talking about the results here at the event. And sure enough, open source talent remains both in demand and limited. You know, the organizations we talked to all said that they're increasing their use of cloud computing and open source this year. Just a huge increase in the last few years in terms of demand for open source talent. I know many of you here are going to be participating in training at the event and growing your job skills as it relates to open source. And if you go and download the report, you'll see that there is tons of opportunity out there for you. In addition, in order to help meet the demand for open source talent, I am proud to say that our training department, there's a few folks here, there they are over there, last week surpassed having trained 2 million individuals. Congratulations to them. You know, these are courses. We are one of the top trainers on the edX platform. We've developed more than 36 free courses covering things like Linux, Kubernetes, blockchain, networking, Node.js, DevOps, open source. And you know, these courses have really provided tremendous opportunity for folks to learn new skills, particularly during the pandemic, in order to pivot to new opportunities. We've also been able to work with a lot of the folks who've gone through these training programs to provide them scholarships and fellowships to take additional training courses through our curriculum and to attend events like these. And we're going to continue to do that as an organization. And again, congratulations to the whole training group for this big, important milestone. Now, there's another milestone this year, which is the 30th anniversary of Linux. It's hard to believe, but it has indeed been 30 years. And you know, I always love to tell this story about how I went on my first blind date with my now wife, who is, for those of you who met her, she's very type A person, went to Harvard Business School, she's executive at a financial services company. And when I told her what I did for a living, that I worked at this nonprofit foundation and it was about open source and we gave everything away, the look of disappointment was just like palpable. But since then, and thanks to, in particular, Linus Torvalds and the kernel community and the broader open source movement, I was not only able to marry my wife, but I think we've collectively proven all of the skeptics wrong when it comes to the impact of open source. You know, I was trying to go and find some statistics to show just how big Linux is. And when you start looking into it, it's so ubiquitous that every statistic just becomes almost nonsensical when you list them off one by one. I mean, I think it's just safe to say that Linux and open source software simply run the vast majority of the world's computing systems, which is amazing. And it's freely available for anyone to use. Anyone can come and participate in the co-development of it. It's really impressive. I love telling people, even if they've never heard of Linux, that they use it every day and they probably don't even know it. And when I was thinking about the 30th anniversary, I went back to a presentation that I did at the 20th anniversary of Linux, which was just north of here in Vancouver. And the first slide that I had in that was this one: the importance of being on the right side of history. You know, in the last 18, 20 months, it seems like we've all kind of been so much further apart, not just, physically, but just as different societies around the world. You know, we've sort of gone from sort of collaboration to more isolation. You know, we've had conflict globally. We've all been isolated from each other. And I think one of the things that we can all be proud of on the 30th anniversary of Linux is that the right side of history favors collaboration. And Linux is such an amazing multi-trillion-dollar existence proof of that by working together, we can have better outcomes, even when working together as competitors. That all of us are indeed smarter than any one of us, and that even the most fierce rivals, by cooperating, can have better outcomes both collectively and individually. And that was true 10 years ago. It's even more true today. And I think it's even more important that we all remember that, given sort of the state of the world today and the challenges that we have. And boy, it's not just Linux. Open source has really sort of proven this point out again and again and again. You know, early in my days at the Linux Foundation, we were trying to explain the importance of open source, just period, how it works, what the sharing regimes look like, how you participate, why it's beneficial. Today, we're so far beyond that. It is just safe to say that open source now is the dominant form of software development. It is in every major technology product or service, period. It is just the foundation of the global technology supply chain. And what's even more interesting, as we sort of have gone to this world where we're a little bit more distant, is that the pendulum towards cooperation and collaboration continues to accelerate. That there's something there that should give us all hope on the 30th anniversary of Linux and on the success of open source writ large, that this isn't getting smaller, it's getting larger, right? And that there are just millions of open source applications and interesting code and packages out there that are growing every single day. Now, I think what's also important to remember is even though it continues to grow, the value of the projects like Linux or Node.js or Kubernetes or many of the other projects, both here at the Linux Foundation and at other organizations worldwide, are getting more important. It may be a smaller number, but they're getting more and more important. And one of the things that we also need to work on as we sort of see the pendulum swing back towards cooperation, that I think is going to happen as we emerge from this pandemic and as we get over ourselves and our isolation and competition, is that these cooperative ecosystems need care and feeding. And I hope that everyone who participates in open source ecosystems both remembers that and participates in that care and feeding. You know, it is super important for us to continue to be this example for collective innovation and collective problem solving. And creating these healthy ecosystems is something that we think about all the time at the Linux Foundation, about how we can have a great open source project that solves a big challenge, whether it's a technical challenge, whether it's a societal challenge, that can be used in different products and services, create value in the form of financial profits or benefit to government and society, and then have that wealth reinvested back into the project. That's what is super important. And you know why I'm super optimistic that we're all going to swing back to more cooperation and collaboration globally? Is that at the Linux Foundation, just in our little corner of the world, the demand for what we do, even during the pandemic, has been exploding. I mean, these are some older statistics. When I kind of went and thought about updating, you know, it's just mind-blowing. Again, it comes back to that, you know, what's a credible number when the numbers are so huge? This is just at the Linux Foundation in terms of millions of lines of code being added and removed across all our projects every week. Hundreds of thousands of contributors. I mean, just hundreds and thousands of pull requests, hundreds and thousands of builds monitored, issues logged, bugs found, bugs fixed, you know, contribution agreements processed. Think of that. Last year, we processed 30,000 contribution agreements. This is in order for people to participate in an open source project and make sure that there's an intentionality to copyright assignment and who owns what, so you share what you want to share, you get to keep what you want to keep. I mean, that took an amazing amount of work. It took innovation in terms of not only the processes, but the agreements themselves in order to facilitate this huge demand for collaboration. And it's just great to be at a place where every day we get reminded that, hey, we're not so alone, that cooperation does succeed. And what's even better is not only the demand for kind of what we do and what you all do is growing, but the scope of collaboration continues to grow. One of the things that we're seeing at the Linux Foundation is that innovation outcomes, in terms of achieving them collectively, are starting to kind of grow and morph into a pantheon of collective innovation tools. And across our communities, we're seeing different challenges, whether it's addressing climate change, finding cures for rare disease, or just building the de facto cloud orchestration standard with Kubernetes, that our communities want to use these different levers, whether it's standard setting. We became a path submitter to ISO and have already submitted several standards for international accreditation. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Whether it's open hardware initiatives such as RISC-V, whether it's the traditional open source development that we facilitate, or new forms of governance networks. These are permission blockchains that industry are using to create more efficiency in industry like insurance or pharmaceuticals. What we're seeing is that there's a whole new set of structures that we need to facilitate this great collective innovation. Not to name drop, but I'm gonna. At one point, I was at an event at Google. This was at their Google Next conference, and I was backstage with Vint Cerf. And I was asking him about, how they came up with things like W3C, IETF, and so forth, as the internet was growing. And what he told me, I thought was super interesting. He said, we sort of built institutions as we needed them. And that's what's kind of going on here as well. We're building new approaches to standards development that are more complementary to the way that open source software is co-developed in the open. We're building these new governance networks. We're building new ways to think about collaborative hardware development. And I think that Vince's line still holds true. We're sort of building these things out as we need them, as this demand for collaboration continues to grow and grow in an insane way. We are super proud at the Linux Foundation to be home to over 750 open source projects. This is something I don't think a lot of people realize about the Linux Foundation, because we've joked for a long time, the first rule about the Linux Foundation is don't talk about the Linux Foundation. Our sort of corporate culture, we have this saying, humble, helpful, hopeful. It's sort of our ethos within the organization itself, in that the stars of the show here is not necessarily the Linux Foundation or our team, even though I think they do a great job. It's the developers and the technologists and all the people that work on these 750 projects. And because we are not a command and control economy, if you don't have humility at the Linux Foundation, you're going to have a tough time succeeding in helping these projects and being optimistic and hopeful about the future. But if you look across all of these different projects, it doesn't take you long to pick out some pretty amazing efforts. Node.js and the OpenJS Foundation. I mean, this is the world's largest development framework for mobile applications and web applications. I mean, if you look in our automotive group, I think Dan Couchy's here from our Automotive Grade Linux initiative. This is in millions of production automobiles. Companies who had never really done a lot of software development, companies like Toyota, Daimler, Honda, Mitsubishi, got together and said, we're going to, instead of competing in the infrastructure that we need for a digital cockpit in a modern automobile, we're going to collaborate. And we'll focus just on that 10% of the experience that is unique to maybe our customer in a Lexus or a Mercedes. And they have taken that code and put it into production across the world in millions of automobiles. I mean, I think anybody in this crowd, if you're committed to come to this event, you've all heard of Kubernetes. I mean, this really has changed the way modern applications get built, deployed, and maintained. And I can keep on going in terms of the outcomes that we've been seeing. Let's Encrypt has taken the amount of traffic on the internet that was encrypted from 40-odd% up into the 80% zone. in a very short period of time by providing a completely free TLS certificate for the world. In our networking initiatives, we're seeing telecommunication companies not only abstract their networks into software, but open sourcing that software in order to get better innovation outcomes so that they can deal with the demand for 5G and edge computing. And it can keep going and going and going. And you're going to see a few more of these new projects today. Just this summer, we announced a bunch of new initiatives, ranging from things like RareCamp that you're going to hear about in a few minutes. That is an open source effort to find cures for rare diseases, to the Open 3DE engine, which you're going to hear about next, to things that have an even bigger impact than just in the technology sector. Things like AgStack. This is a platform to build out a set of precision agriculture tools to help modernize farming for better crop efficiency, better water utilization, and more. The Green Software Foundation. This is a terrific initiative kicked off this summer by a bunch of companies, Microsoft sort of leading on this one. You know, the world's data centers today use about 1% of the world's electricity. And that's anticipated to go to almost 3 to 5%. And the idea here with the Green Software Foundation is how do we keep that sort of power footprint lower by producing more energy efficient software, data centers, and more. It's an important initiative that helps solve a huge problem. And then, in the beginning of COVID, one of the first things that the Linux Foundation did was we started an initiative called the Linux Foundation Public Health Effort. This was started by the late Dan Kahn in order to immediately use the collaborative tools that we had to try and stem the spread of COVID-19. That initially was working on exposure notification systems, contact tracing and exposure notification systems that have been used by governments like Ireland, Canada, in states across the United States, New York, and others, and is now expanded into working on global COVID certification networks for vaccine credentialing and other things beyond that. We're really hoping that the Linux Foundation public health effort can not only help address COVID-19, but can create an open source sort of war chest of code that can be immediately used to address future pandemics and health crises. This isn't going to just stop with us all getting back together and being able to go about our normal lives. We need to be prepared for the next eventuality, and that's something that we really care about at the Linux Foundation. Some of the other things that we're working on include cybersecurity initiatives and supply chain efforts. I want to give a shout out to our SPDX initiative. This is a specification for software bill of materials that makes it easier for organizations to track what software they're actually using. You're going to hear from one of our speakers about security problems across devices and the supply chain, and it's pretty hard to address a security vulnerability if you don't know what you're actually running. I want to give a shout out to the collective effort of the SPDX team. I see Kate Stewart sitting right in the second row there. She gets a special photo shout out. Thank you, Kate, for all of your hard work on this, along with Jelaine, Gary, Phil, Steve, Paul, and Jack. It's really been amazing. But we've come so far, and I really believe that we're ushering in almost this unselfish century. And open source can be a point of inspiration for that. But we do have to look at some of the challenges within our own world and try and think of how we can improve open source so that it can be this exemplar of cooperation to the rest of the world. And I was thinking about what are the big challenges that we all face as a movement in open source. And in this era where open source is now a critical part, an essential component of the global technology supply chain, which impacts all of our lives every single day. Whether it's in our ability to keep the lights on through software-driven electrical grids, or be able to make phone calls, or drive cars that are now run on very complex multi-million line code bases. These are some of the things that we have in front of us that are big challenges. Cybersecurity is an immediate one that comes to mind. You know, I like to talk about how in the early 2000s, Bill Gates wrote this letter to everyone at Microsoft saying, we're going to stop work on software. We're going to make sure that we get everybody to take secure coding classes and threat model our code, and we're going to have better testing and so forth. And if we don't do it, we're not going to, you know, you're in big trouble and you'll get fired if you don't actually get in line with this software quality assurance and security effort. Well, in open source, we don't have the same kind of command and control. We don't get to fire people in an organic form of innovation. So I think one of the big things that we need to look at is how do we create a culture of secure coding practices and work across the global supply chain to improve the baseline for cybersecurity for all of us. This is something that we can have an immediate impact on just by fixing bugs. I think projects are pretty good at finding bugs. We're not as good at fixing bugs. Immediate impact. Another big challenge is the rise of techno-nationalism. This is that sort of isolationism that I'm talking about. I mean, I don't think we need to go very far in the headlines to see, you know, statements around trade conflicts, digital sovereignty, and I don't think there's anything wrong with sovereignty, but we don't want to swing that pendulum too far to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The collective innovation goodness that comes from free and open exchange of ideas that we see in open source shouldn't be thrown out just in the name of some, you know, form of techno-nationalism. And finally, I think we can use the open source examples and even just the processes ourselves to solve some bigger global problems. I want to dive a little deeper into security with the last few minutes that I have and talk about just what is going on across the global software supply chain and why open source has a tremendous opportunity to improve the security baseline for us all. I want to credit this graphic to the folks at Google. In fact, this Salsa framework is up on GitHub. We can send out the URL on our website. But I think it does an incredibly good job of showing the different sort of attack vectors and sort of collective weaknesses across the global software supply chain that we can all collectively recognize and address. Whether it's in, you know, a developer source repository where you may not have the best secure coding practices or testing coverage or threat modeling and so forth, or in build systems that can create weaknesses, or in dependencies that can be hijacked, or in package managers that can be usurped. You know, these are where we're seeing all these threats happen. Software supply chain breaches are up in a massive way. They present a collective risk to us all, a risk that we can help improve in making it better. You know, the Linux Foundation is really working hard. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but we have dozens of initiatives to go into those sort of linchpin points in the software security supply chain in order to make things better. Whether it's the Core Infrastructure Initiative's badging program that helps open source projects both adopt and advertise the fact that they do secure coding practices in an effective way. Whether it's things like package signing services like SigStore, Tough, which is an update framework, or our Open Source Security Foundation, or the SPDX initiative for tracking software bill of materials across the supply chain, we are taking this super seriously. I think that the other big challenge around techno-nationalism is something that I'd like to ask all of us in our communities to continue to emphasize. The free and open exchange of ideas is what creates so much benefit. If on the 30th anniversary of Linux, y'all can do nothing else, but just keep saying, look, here, it works. The companies and the countries that work on Linux are huge rivals. Like, there is no love lost between Microsoft and Amazon and Google when it comes to things like competition for customers. But they all collectively contribute at a very high level to these open source projects that run all their cloud computing solutions. Finally, and I'll end with this, I think there is another opportunity in this next phase of open source, as it is the critical way that software gets developed, to think even bigger. You know, back when I first met my wife all that time ago, you know, the thing that I would always tell people is that, you know, we're thinking big in open source, but we should think even bigger, that we're not thinking nearly big enough. And this is where I think there is great hope for everybody here, to use open source and technology, to the degree that which you are all masters of this, to solve big societal problems. Our OS Climate Initiative is creating an open data sharing alliance so that companies can share financial data, market data about the impact of climate change on the public markets in order to price the cost of climate change into those markets. This is a group of pension funds and insurance companies that, if they are effective at what they do, will start changing their investments and start pushing us towards a greener global economy. I already talked about the Green Software Foundation. Another good example is a project that we have through one of our initiatives called Open Sentencing. This is something that takes collective data to find unfairness in sentencing based on race and can shine a spotlight on this form of social injustice. Another initiative that Priyanka Sharma, who I think is here today, head of CNCF, is working on is our Software Developer Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, to root out offensive language in open source code bases in order to provide more equitable and welcoming communities. And you're going to hear today from more folks who are using open source to find cures to rare diseases, to create a more efficient energy grid, and much, much more. And I think that is the thing I want us all to keep thinking about. How do we solve some of these challenges around security? How do we keep the organic and free flow of ideas? And then how do we harness those things to have huge impact on the world? That's the challenge on the 30th anniversary that I'd like to leave you all with. And I really look forward to seeing all of you in person in 2022 and beyond. Let's hope that a year from now at this time, we've got a lot more people here in person. The international borders are open. We're all healthy and well, and we've been able to move beyond the COVID-19 pandemic and have amazing outcomes like the ones I'm talking about today. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is heading up a new project that I already referenced in mine, but it is one of the newest large-scale efforts around open 3D technology. So many of you are probably familiar with our Academy Software Foundation, which is an initiative where we worked with the film and motion picture industry to open source a lot of the tools that make films. You'll see it in movies like Star Wars and Spider-Man and all of the amazing visual effects that come out of Hollywood. Well, this time we have amped it up to the next level with an open source code base that is going to not only make film and entertainment better, but most importantly, something that is near and dear to me, which is video games. Please welcome our next speaker, Royal O'Brien, who is the general manager of our digital media and games group at the Linux Foundation, to talk about our Open 3D engine. Welcome, Royal.
Good stuff. Good morning, everybody. You know, I'm super excited to be here, for one, because I'm not having to present to a guy named Logitech in front of an audience I never get to see. So it's actually so great to be here. And this is actually my first one of these. So kind of the new guy in the room for those who have already been here a few times. So my name is Royal O'Brien. I'm the general manager of digital media and games, focused around the Open 3D Foundation, which is, of course, the Open 3D engine that we've just recently put out. So let's start here first. You know, where do we begin? So if you take a look, it starts with an idea and a question, kind of like, why did we do this in the first place? And there's a huge divide between big tech world and the gaming world. If you think about it, big tech startups, they're really heavy open source users and contributors. They get the idea of the quality, security, and interoperability with open source type projects. But when we talk about the games industry, they don't really share as well. You'll find out that the things that they have aren't really licensed in an open source manner, or they're generally licensed or restricted. And so it's kind of one area that's been missing for a long time. So the first part was, well, we needed more open source in gaming to start with. Now, if you think about it, there's already 3D engines that are out there. It's good and it can be better. You've got some of the AAA engines out there that are proprietary. The thing about them is you don't get 100% of the source. It may not always be available, and it comes with strings attached. And then breaking changes can sometimes leave long-term projects orphaned. And as a result, sometimes if there's new innovations and things that you want to do, they'll be delayed until the engine can either handle it or can support what it's going to be, or they implement this. And then on top of it, you have some other engines that are like the long tail of AA and limited purpose engines that are out there for specific verticals. They're really good, but they don't have the kind of fidelity that some things are looking for. And then, of course, the open source options. There's a lot of them out there, but they're not really complete. You're going to have to build what you're looking for, or they'll lack some of the core modern features that you find in engines that people assume are going to be there. So the thing is, if you look at a 3D engine, think, well, we can just build one. But it's not really that simple. They're as complex as operating systems. I mean, what does it really take? You've got to put 8 years at least just to get feature parity on these. And then you have the ongoing commitment to just keep pace. There's a huge amount of money that has to go in to fund the teams and technology. And talking about those teams, you have to have experts in science, math, engineering, graphics, hardware, physics, lighting, network, cloud services. There's so many pieces and disciplines to this. It's not something you just stand up and it works on its own. And so when I talk about all these pieces, you then have to find somebody who understands all of them and can put them together and integrate it into a cohesive system that operates together. And I even talked about cross-platform. This is just getting it maybe running on Windows. And so you have to get it working on different hardware and operating systems on top of that. It's a pretty heavy-duty feat. So first thing, you've got to start with a vision, and you have to have a mission. And so it all starts here with the vision. Like, what are we trying to do? The mission of the Open3D engine is to make an open source, fully featured, high fidelity real-time 3D engine for building games and simulations available to every industry. To note, we started with games, but we expanded to every industry because it applies there. You'll find out a lot of new technologies come from games and vice versa. So why limit it? So let's talk about this complete end-to-end, since we're talking about everything that's comprehensive. So when you look at this engine here, what are the major pieces? For one, you need an editor. Something where you have that primary workplace that provides the tools you can create and design. You've got to do your component entities. You've got effects, weather, and dynamic visual systems, terrain and vegetation, where you actually start building these live worlds. But then on top of it, you need to have a renderer, something that's actually going to show realistic. And this shot here is actually from the renderer itself, which is a full PBR type renderer that has deferred rendering and lighting subsystem, which supports DirectX 12, Vulkan, and Metal natively with ray tracing, which means you have cross-platform support that'll do the full fidelity, whichever you choose, Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, or Linux. And then, of course, particle effects subsystems that can be built in or third-party, and the shader material system. And when we talk about this, you want to try to get to something more realistic, something that can show what does metal look like, what does plastic look like, how does it interact with lighting, what does it do when you actually build these materials. And so this is an example of a render. Maybe it's not as clear, but it looks way better close up on a screen, of what can be done from the renderer of what we have in here in real time. So going back over the components, not only is it about rendering, but you also have to make it easy for people to build things on top of. That means having the physics and collision subsystems that can be changed out. That means having a visual scripting language. So if you don't have engineers and you're using this for science, maybe your scientists want to be able to prototype things by drag and box and connecting logic together. Or having Lua, having nav mesh trees, behavior trees, and things so you can extend it even further. The code itself is built in C++, which means that it opens up a lot of avenues in embedded environments or high-performance environments. But you can also extend it with Python, Qt, and the UI extensions. The packaging and asset system is built there, so when you bring things in, it actually can work with them, so you're not waiting to the end to compile it. It's actually built on the fly, ready to go. And you can extend how it operates on those with Python. And everything in the system is built with CMake, which means you get to use your favorite Visual Studio or client or whichever method you want to use, that's your editor, and have it supported as well, including the test systems. And then, of course, all the assets with it. We also have the animation system, which means it has a complete motion effects animation system to do all of those, as well as a cinematic subsystem. So when you start talking about film and things like that, you want to make sure that you actually have support so they can build on top of it. And then networking and cloud, something that allow multiplayer to be able to play against each other. That's a full-blown stack that can handle everything from shooters to type of trading sessions, but also having cloud services that can bring, say, full GIS data in and build entire cities in real time by tile that can work on the renderer, no matter how you want to make that. So let's talk about some of the other last components, and that is the platform support. Having the tools and chain to be able to build for multiple platforms. So you're talking native Windows, Mac, and Linux editor authoring and runtime support. Not where you build it on Windows and it runs on other. I'm talking about having a Mac editor that lets you build on Mac and actually have it run on Mac, or build on Ubuntu, build on Linux, and actually run on Linux. So that's the big thing here, where you don't need just a Windows box anywhere in the system to be able to use this. Having mobile platform, Android and iOS, VR and AR support, as well as console support like Xbox, PlayStation, Switch, but you'll need the vendor agreements because that stuff is actually proprietary and you work with them on that. So to whom and why is this actually important? Well, the reality is that it's important to developers because they can spend more time building what they're trying to actually build as a game or a simulation versus spending all their time trying to refine an engine. They also get a big head start because they actually have everything they need to get started and to build upon it. And they also become part of a diverse community with a lot of high-quality experts in many areas. You get to interact with them on a continual basis. It's free to use, and it has a flexible open-source Apache licensing that allow you to do pretty much anything you want when you fork it or use it. So why is it important to companies? Well, for one, they can actually support and sustain projects that they have so that their customers and developers can actually depend on it. And they can better align their downstream projects with the upstream community. They can identify with the community experts and attract talent. You can find people who are committing to GitHub, find out the conversations, who's actually leading the pack, and attract them. And they know of the higher reliability and lower maintenance and sustainment costs. The other thing is that companies, when they become a partner, they can actually influence the project and some of the direction of where it goes. And they also can accelerate the needs by taking on a formal or informal project within the actual project itself. So it's not just open source. You can't just throw this over the wall. It all starts with a sustainable ecosystem. This is really important for the model. So if you think of it from an open source environment, we have the technical community that's out there. They have felt needs and they know what they need. And then that winds up becoming some of the projects that become the technology. And then that turns around and becomes the products that get built as a result of it that people can begin using, which then open up different markets and allow more participation to come back in. So this is a good flywheel that we see commonly. But when you bring it in with companies, it's another environment because they work along with that same community, and it's a balanced flywheel where they can actually have the enablement of these projects that actually come from the community's felt needs, which they can take the projects, create products as well that they can commercialize and support this market, which allows them to actually benefit, produce profits, and then contribute back into the community, growing the resulting project of what's happening. So you have this balance between open source where they inure the benefit just like the commercial public does. When you use a web browser, you don't exactly use that to build your web pages, you use the tools around it. It's the companies that help you support to what you want to build. Same thing involved here. Also for your partners, you've got to be diligent on who your partners are. So we started with a handful of partners that have a vested interest that were like, you know what, these are things we can build on top of. We've got everything from content developers, game studios, cloud providers, and these were the starting point of where we actually built. They're not all game companies as well. So it's really important to have them involved. Community growth, since we've started this out, in our just last month, we've had almost 100 authors of code, over 600 code commits, 5,300 file changes, over 750,000 code line changes from GitHub alone of what's happened. We run this as a central hub of Discord with almost 1,500 users with an average of 400 online at any time, which means if you have a problem, you can drop into Discord in any of the SIGs and get help immediately. There are an average of 300 to 500 messages a day going on within the community and over 3,000 minutes of collective audio and video of people communicating. It is a very active and fast-moving community for only being alive for 2 months. If we talk about the industries and verticals here, this can be used because it's C and C++. We have embedded hardware implementations that you can use this in, robotics and device simulation that when you use it for training models and PBR. You have film and special effects for being able to build those environments. If you're talking about the metaverse and the open metaverse, being able to use an open source 3D engine that allows you to do the experiences with it is really important. Real estate, when they want to take a plot of GIS land, determine what the environmental will be, how that's going to work within the building, and how they can change the BOM and lower the costs. It's really important. Automotive, on top of that, being able to do car selection or do in-dash type of entertainment systems. And then, of course, aerospace, because you have a pluggable API that allows them to switch that out. And self-driving companies that need to train for millions and millions of hours that can scale this into a cloud using ARM systems. And then, of course, security and large-scale theater. Everything in here is driven through special interest groups. And so we're divided into 12 SIGs. Each one has a specific discipline with a common purpose of advancing that particular area. And that allows us to do our distributed decision and management structure that allows us to get new ideas and get things done with different contributors. Last but not least, we have a conference coming up, O3D Con. That'll be held the same time as KubeCon on the 11th and 12th. We invite everybody to come out and take a look and see what we're doing. We have about 21 different sessions that'll be there. They'll learn everything from top to bottom on the people who have worked on this for years, as well as the community, and have a lot of different panels and discussions that'll be there. So if you happen to be out there for KubeCon, we'd love to see you. And thank you very much. All right, Jim. Hey.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
It's amazing. Like, I can't wait to see like a whole new generation of game developers with a free 3D engine producing super cool new games.
I'm looking forward to seeing actually how some of the vertical industries take advantage of some of these things, and they bleed over into the games.
Yeah.
When you see somebody who wants to use a virtual LiDAR system, and that appears in a game that can do detection for AI in a game that you've never played.
Yeah.
Just crazy things like that, so.
Sky's the limit.
Yep.
Thanks a ton.
Thanks a lot.
All right, our next speaker is someone who I think is going to inspire all of you, who is working on one of the projects I referenced earlier. Sanath Ramesh is a software developer, and he is also a rare disease drug developer. He's going to talk today about the OpenTreatments Foundation. This is an open source project that is using collaborative development to find cures for rare diseases that really can have an impact on hundreds of millions of people worldwide who suffer from these rare diseases. And this is something for Sanath Ramesh that is personal. His 2-year-old boy was diagnosed as one of the 9 kids in the world who suffer from a rare genetic disease called SSMD. So what you're going to see here is a personal motivation and a collective response that's inspiring, I think, to me certainly, and I think will be to all of you. So please welcome Sanath Ramesh.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I am Sanath Kumar Ramesh, and I'm the proud father of this charming 3-year-old boy, Raghav. When Raghav was just 1 year old, he discovered a bug in an open source code that had actually killed several people. I'm talking about bugs in our genetic code, our DNA, that causes devastating diseases, creating unimaginable suffering. Over the next 10 minutes, you will learn about rare genetic diseases, its sweeping impact on the society, and how open source has the key to putting an end to this suffering. On a beautiful summer afternoon, right here in Seattle, we had organized our son's first birthday party. It was the first time my friends and family were meeting my son, so we were super excited. As I was getting ready to cut the cake, I got a phone call. This was from Raghav's doctor. In a very sad tone, she said, "We ran all the tests and we've got the results from it. We think Raghav has an ultra-rare genetic disease. But unfortunately, we don't know much about this disease because all the kids with this condition died just a few weeks after birth. We think your son is lucky to be alive." I was taken aback I am standing at my son's first of many birthday parties to come, and someone is telling me that Raghav is lucky to be alive. This was a turning point in my career, in my whole life. I learned that Raghav has a typo in his DNA, in his genetic code. All of us have 3.2 billion characters that make up our genetic code that determines everything about who we are, how tall we grow, the color of our eyes, and everything that defines us as a person. Raghav has a typo in the GPX4 gene where the character G was misspelled as A. And because of this typo, Raghav is unable to sit, stand, walk, talk, eat anything by mouth, or even hold a toy in his hand. In fact, kids born with the typo in GPX4 gene don't make it past few weeks after their birth. In this day and age with tremendous scientific advancements, we would expect to have a treatment for Raghav's disease. And so I cold called and cold emailed hundreds of researchers, hospitals, biotech companies around the world trying to find treatment for Raghav. Guess how many treatments I found? A big, fat 0. In fact, Raghav's disease will likely never get a treatment. The biotech industry is nearly a $1 trillion industry, but there is not even $1 single available to create a treatment for Raghav. In fact, if there was a wait list for kids to get new treatments, Raghav and his disease would stand last on the wait list. Do you know why? It's because Raghav's disease is what is called a market failure. The cost of building new treatments run upwards of $50 million to even $1 billion. So companies, when they create a treatment for Raghav's disease, cannot make enough profit by selling them to just 9 patients worldwide. That's just the number of patients that Raghav's disease has today. This is crazy. This is totally unacceptable for me. I said, screw this, let me take matter in my own hands. So I started a foundation, raised some money, got a group of researchers together, and tried 5 different drugs on Raghav. Some of them did show some improvements. After just starting, 48 hours after starting one of the treatments, Raghav started lifting his head up for the very first time that he had never done in 13 months of his life. But none of these drugs gave Raghav the quality of life he deserves. At 3 years of age, today, he is still unable to sit, stand, walk, talk, do any of the activities that a normal 3-year-old would do. In fact, we think his disease is progressing faster than we previously anticipated. Unfortunately, Raghav is not alone. He is one of 400 million patients worldwide suffering from rare genetic diseases that just have 10 patients, 100 patients, 1,000 patients, too few patients for any one company to care about to create a treatment. If you take all of these patients and put them in one country, we're talking about the 3rd largest country in the world, and 95% of them do not have any treatments. Since last March, I've asked over 200 researchers this one simple question. In addition to researchers, I asked C-level executives of publicly traded biotech companies, top researchers in this field, FDA directors, patients, nonprofit organizations, how do we bring treatments to all of the rare diseases such that no single patient like Raghav is left behind? Fortunately, there is no simple solution because we are dealing with an incredibly complex ecosystem, pretty much like a maze. The maze has innumerable number of stakeholders from patients, researchers, companies, hospitals, insurance providers, government organizations, all entangled among one another. Adding to the complexity, the biology of most of these diseases is just a complete mystery. We need many scientific breakthroughs and business model breakthroughs to make rare disease drug development an economical and a profitable venture. I know this is super grim, but the experts offered some hope. Based on COVID and all the recent developments in the past, they felt like if we fostered more open collaboration among all the parties, lowered the cost of drug development, and operated at a global scale, we have a more likely chance of bringing treatments to all these diseases. And this rang a bell, because this is exactly what open source is really good at. In my professional career, over the last 10 years, I have built and launched several successful open source communities. So I know that if we do this right, open source has the potential to pave the road to treatments, not only for Raghav, but also to 400 million patients worldwide. This is incredibly exciting. So I got together with a group of friends and started OpenTreatments Foundation. This is a nonprofit organization with the mission of bringing treatments to every genetic disease accessible to every patient on the planet. We launched the foundation on March 2021 with 4 strategies to reaching our mission. The first step is raising the awareness of every disease so that no single disease is left behind. The second step is making all the diseases easy to work with by open sourcing animal models, natural history data, open sourcing disease models, and so on. And all the raw materials necessary to make the diseases easy to work with. The third step is to unlock new sources of funding that would bring and incentivize more people to come into rare disease drug development. And the fourth step is to decentralize drug development as a whole. We will be building software platforms, open communities, and new open data licenses to execute on the strategy. And this is why we collaborated with Linux Foundation to create the new RareCamp project that will house all of the source code under an Apache 2.0 license and create open communities for us to freely and transparently collaborate as we save these patients. Over 15 people have contributed to the development of the platform so far. This is from software developers, content developers, UX designers, drug developers, along with collaborations from 8 different institutions. But this is just the beginning. The suffering that my son goes through, the suffering that my family goes through, and the suffering that every rare disease family goes through is immeasurable. You have the opportunity to put an end to the suffering once and for all simply by pursuing your passion. Come join our community, spend a couple of hours on a weekend, and help us build a software platform that will one day give kids like Raghav the opportunity to play in the park, go to college, and live a life they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing. What an inspiration. This is something where I encourage all of you, either the folks who are watching virtually or folks here, to go check this project out and to participate in something like this. 30 years of Linux, critical part of the software supply chain. It'd be pretty easy for all of us to sort of rest on our laurels and pat ourselves on the back. But as you can see, we're just getting started addressing huge issues like rare diseases. In order to do that, we're going to spend the next couple of sessions here talking about security. In order to solve big problems, people need to trust the software that comes from these collaborative communities. Our next speaker, Chris Wright, is the CTO of Red Hat. He unfortunately couldn't join us physically today, but he's going to talk with us virtually about the importance of security in a trusted software supply chain. Please welcome virtually Chris Wright.
Hey, thank you for having me here to talk about open source software and supply chain security. As most of you know, in the US and around the globe, businesses and organizations have experienced a number of high-profile and costly security attacks over the past few years. And the sobering truth is, the attacks are not going to stop. which is why our collective work on security is so important. All I have to do is mention a few names, and you'll likely remember the severity of these recent attacks. SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, JBS, those are just a couple of the most recent and sensational attacks that have gone public. According to Forrester's report, The State of Application Security 2021, 30% of external breaches were caused by software vulnerabilities. But as SolarWinds showed, not only are your internal operations disrupted by a breach, but your customers' lives can get severely disrupted as a result. In response to several security breaches and the ongoing need to enhance software security, the White House released an executive order in May 2021. This order seeks to improve the nation's cybersecurity and has significant implications for companies in the US. Though its scope covers the United States, it does reflect similar efforts in other regions around the world. The difference being that the US order is far more specific and has tight deadlines. And those will be felt across the open source community. For a company like Red Hat, and probably for many of you here, we are very interested in Section 4 of the Executive Order, Enhancing Software Supply Chain Security. Of the numerous standards and requirements to be met, here are 3 that stood out to me. And just know that I'm paraphrasing the main points. Here's my first one. We must use automated tools or processes to maintain the integrity of source code and to check for known and potential vulnerabilities and remediate them. A second one of note, maintain data about audits, origin of software and components, and utilize secure software development practices. And here's a big one for this audience, ensure and attest to the integrity and provenance of open source software used within any portion of a product. The administration knows it can't do this on its own. And as the order states, the private sector must partner with the federal government to foster a secure cyberspace. And in the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is. Transparency, partnership, and trust. Those important words should be familiar to everyone who's involved in open source communities and software development. So here's the situation we find ourselves in. The software supply chain is fragile. That's according to the Forrester Application Security Report. This challenge is not breaking news for open source advocates. It's been said before by my fellow Red Hatters, and it's worth mentioning again. How do you secure a supply chain for a product that has no physical form, no box to lock, and is created in an environment where anyone can contribute to it? The open source community is a group of individuals who, in fact, respect each other's anonymity. So you don't necessarily have to know the other person who created the code, but you do need to trust them. This is the practical reality of open source that's at odds with knowing exactly where all your code is coming from. Recently published research on understanding the motivation of open source software contributors and how those relate to software security is particularly concerning. Research that was just released found that expecting open source software contributors to voluntarily address security issues is unlikely to succeed. The crux of the researchers' advice is twofold. First, a multi-party effort composed of corporate, government organizations, and individual contributors will be necessary to ensure software security in the future. And second, a better understanding of the scope of the problem must occur. So let's think about that scope. The relationships that exist in open source communities are very unique if you stop and consider it. People in open source communities are fundamentally dependent on each other to get anything done. And as we all know, the software created by these communities comes with an astounding number of software dependencies. We pull each other's code all the time, which demonstrates the high level of implicit trust. And that trust creates the collaborative spirit, the bonds that form over time that powers open source communities. Kubernetes, as an example, involves a huge number of dependencies that come together to deliver this amazing software whose growth is skyrocketing. So the good news is open source software usage is only going to grow. Did you know that 99% of audited code bases contain some amount of open source code? That's according to the Forrester survey I mentioned earlier. And that's also the bad news, that open source software usage is only going to grow. What I mean is that these increases are going to attract more bad actors and more new threats. Attacks on open source code increased by a whopping 430% between 2019 and 2020, according to last year's State of the Software Supply Chain report. The thing is, this critical security work can and will be done. How do I know this? Well, let's look at what happened within Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Despite the backdrop of open source supply chain security concerns, 95% of Fortune 500 companies today rely on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. It's a stable and highly secure product as a result of mature change controls, and is trusted not just in the US, but all over the world. So coming back to the three keywords I highlighted earlier, transparency, partnership, and trust. That's how we've gotten it done in the past, and that's how we'll continue to do it in the future. All of this makes me think of a quote from a former Red Hatter who worked in our open source and standards group. It was written several years ago about our collective role, but it's just as relevant today. At the end of the day, open source has kept us honest. We can't lie, we can't cheat, we can't steal. All of this is what makes open source more secure. Because open source means everyone can see what you're doing. They can also verify and validate your software and security protocols. One idea to secure software supply chains lies in digitally signing the artifacts that comprise applications, including a software bill of materials, component manifests, dependency trees, and the like. Digital signatures effectively freeze an object in time, which indicates that in its current state, the object is verified to be what it says it is, and that it hasn't been altered in any way. This is great for developers who are pulling lots of code from many sources into complicated workloads. Now, many digital signing tools are good at what they do, but they're often laborious, cumbersome, or expensive. And they also don't fit the model of open source's innovation engine and automated development processes such as DevOps and CI/CD. Being laborious, cumbersome, and expensive will always be problematic. But there's also the matter of who holds and protects the cryptographic keys. These keys are critical. They provide identification that says the code came from a specific given source and allows a user or system to make a decision based on the trustworthiness of that source. In open communities with countless contributors, is everyone supposed to hold a private key? Just the community leads, if they exist, or the sponsor? What happens if an individual is compromised? And how do we know it is the individual key holder and not an imposter? This is the massive challenge facing the software supply chain, especially in open source. Without constant identity checks and safety protocols for keys and secrets, open source dependencies can open the door to breaches, exploits, and supply chain attacks. and we think we've found a great solution to these challenges. It's in an open source project, originally prototyped at Red Hat and now under the auspices of the Linux Foundation with backing from Red Hat, Google, and others. SigStore offers a method to enhance security for software supply chains in an open, transparent, and accessible manner. SigStore aims to make software signing ubiquitous in much the same way that Let's Encrypt made X509 certificates for TLS commonplace. Before Let's Encrypt, you may recall, you would have seen HTTPS in your address bar only when you were shopping on e-commerce sites. That's because there were billions of dollars at stake, and it was no coincidence that there was a higher level of security required and delivered. Online shoppers needed confidence that their credit card numbers weren't going to be stolen. The technology worked. Now, given how accessible the certificates are, nearly every site runs HTTPS and is, by definition, more secure. This is the model SigStore is following. SigStore is intended to make cryptographic signing easier and available to all. And most importantly, it's available at no cost. SigStore removes the cryptographic burden and makes it accessible. This happens by enabling developers to use an email address via the OpenID Connect protocol as a pre-existing identifier to sign their code. The project also produces an open but immutable activity log for anyone to audit. To offer all of these capabilities and become a widely used free service, we need to establish trust. You'll remember our three key words: transparency, partnership, and trust. Without trust, SigStore can't be counted on by other authorities or services to show that an individual is who they say they are, and also that the produced software is what it claims to be. That's transparency. We have big plans with SigStore, and that's where partnership comes into the picture. So far, the community counts more than 675 commits, more than 465 members, and 20 organizations. And SigStore is still scaling up, along with the sub-projects Recore, a timestamping service and transparency log, and Fulcio, a free code signing certificate authority. We're working with the Linux Foundation to stand up a fully staffed public service, and we're trying to grow the community. So we'd love to have you join us. Transparency, partnership, and trust for the sources you use in your applications and underlying software stacks are not the whole trust story. Even an application composed completely from trusted sources becomes dangerous the moment it's not actively checked for new defects and security issues, both in the application itself and its underlying code dependencies. DevSecOps practices and their automated tools have evolved to make this manageable, but we want to do even better. The goal of Red Hat's AI DevSecOps initiative is to ease this burden using AI-enabled automation for best practices for software development and lifecycle management. Integrations and bots that plug into CI/CD systems help developers define software stacks in a predictable manner. And they also automate the task of ongoing maintenance, stack optimization, updates to new versions, tests, and security fixes. These automation tools are backed by a guidance system that learns from actual developer use, community interactions, and automated testing that improves its behavior over time. Our initial implementation of this concept is in an open source service called Project Thoth. Thoth uses AI to analyze and recommend software stacks for Python applications with an initial focus on data science use cases. Data scientists can use Thoth through a Jupyter Lab plugin that integrates the guidance directly into their preferred tool, as well as automation integrated into the build pipelines. This allows data scientists to focus on the actual job, data science, without being burdened by the complexities and security challenges of the underlying software stacks. I'd like to conclude by telling you that an open approach has always and will always be important to project security and vulnerability management. Now, because everything we do at Red Hat is open, you'll be unsurprised to know that Red Hat adheres to an open methodology to vulnerability management. In fact, we just released a white paper that explains our approach to managing vulnerabilities discovered within components of our software. The paper describes the frameworks, standards, techniques, and tools Red Hat employs for our customers. Hopefully, you'll find something in this white paper that's useful to you. From start to finish, we produce enterprise open source software with transparency and accountability. We partner with the community and our customers. And we hope, in the end, the work we do on open source security creates the necessary trust for everyone we are fortunate to collaborate with. Transparency, partnership, and trust. It's what's helped the open source community get to where we are in 2021, and it's what's going to help us continue to move forward together. So thank you for your time today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Open Source Summit.
All right. Thanks, Chris. So our next guest is a security industry veteran. She has been in charge of top security positions at companies like Fastly, Square, Intel, Mozilla, and more. This year, she decided to go start her own company, Thistle Technologies, with the goal of helping IoT manufacturers improve their security and deliver secure solutions. Can you imagine there are some security challenges in the IoT sector? This crowd, I think, knows this better than most. Please welcome Window Snyder. We get to our socially distanced conversation.
That makes sense.
Thanks for coming. Last time I saw you was 3 years ago in Vancouver, similar topic on security. But since then, security has definitely grown in terms of its urgency. Software has become so important to our lives. Security, of course, is an important part of that as a result. What have you seen in terms of the conversation that we've been having today around open source and its impact on security? We talked about it before, but since then, what do you think?
Well, I definitely think the industry recognizes the importance of security, but it doesn't mean that it's easy to deliver on what we know we need to do. So I've seen a lot of folks making progress, making a real attempt. But as an industry, we're not keeping up with the way threats are evolving, the way they're changing. So how do we get from where we are to where we need to be? That's the question that I'm struggling with. And in terms of whether it's at the general purpose OS level or if it's at the embedded level, the embedded devices are, they're really not at the same level of security resilience that we see in the general purpose operating systems. And for a long time, it made sense to pare these OSs down or to only build a very minimal set of functionality, just what you need to get the job done. You want it to be as fast as possible. You've got highly constrained resources. So it's a very different sort of environment than, let's say, the data center or a workstation. And so, unfortunately, one of the things that fell by the wayside were a lot of the security advances that we've made that have gone into the general purpose operating systems. And unfortunately, these devices are deployed in the same network with all these other devices, but without the same security work that has gone into these general purpose operating systems. So things like, for some of these devices, they might not have separation of privileges, they might not have compartmentalization, they might not have the memory mitigations that we've seen that reduce the impact of memory corruption issues. So that's one of the things that's been causing me great concern, especially since we last talked.
Yeah, I mean, you're a super talented person. You could have done anything in security, and you chose IoT. To go start your own company on this? What is it because you thought, hey, this is the big attack vector, or what were you thinking when it comes to IoT and security?
Well, I've done the building security organizations. I've worked on teaching folks how to build a security program to make more resilient code in your products. And it's incredibly hard. It requires a lot of resources for a lot of these companies, especially given how the threats have changed over time and how much more resilient our devices and our systems need to be. So the advice and the work that I've been doing ends up working really well in organizations that, first of all, have the commitment. Maybe they've got customers or users that have really clear, recognized security requirements, and so they're willing to make that kind of investment. But for a lot of development teams, they're just struggling to get the core features out, struggling to deliver a delightful experience to their users or fit everything into a small amount of resources. And additionally, finding security software engineers is incredibly difficult. And they're in high demand and in short supply. So how do we get all of these device manufacturers and different teams to leapfrog into the security requirements they have, not just for today, and here's the really painful part for me, these devices end up being deployed in the field, and they have a lifespan that's much longer than a lot of our software, even our OS installations, where they might be in the field if it's a car for 10, 20 years, if it's a component in a smart city, maybe 30 years. So we need to really think on a different timeline about how to create resilient software and how to support resilient software over time. And that's what the problem that I was really inspired by, that they first of all haven't been able to adopt a lot of the lessons that general purpose operating systems have been able to incorporate into their security architecture, number one. And then number two, they were going to be facing a different set of security risks over the lifetime of those products. So as far as security challenges go, it really seemed like that was the most pressing space, and it also seemed like a space where we could really have a lot of impact.
Help us put a finger on the pulse for the embedded device and IoT industry, in that it sounds, resource constrained, not a lot of security expertise, needing to provide some form of update. I have a lot of IoT devices. Some of them you can't even update at all. When you talk to these different manufacturers and device makers, what are they telling you is their biggest challenge?
So what I'm hearing is that for a lot of these device manufacturers, the relationship with the customer ends when they sell the device, and they're not making money after that point. So getting to a place where they actually can justify continuing to invest in this risky process of updating. Like, if you have 100 million users using your software, and you've got a failure rate for update that looks like 4 or 5%. That user, when they fail, they just reboot the device. They reinitiate the update, and everything's fine for the most part. If you have 100 million devices out in the field and you initiate an update, and you've got even a 1% failure rate, that might be 1 million devices out there that require someone to drive back to the dealership or bring a phone into the store, or maybe that device is just gone forever. If it's a satellite, good luck, right? So a failure rate that would be tolerable in the software world does not translate to the hardware device world. And the consequences of a failure can be devastating. If that's that one MRI device in that regional hospital, and that's the update that fails, that's completely intolerable. But those devices can get malware. So it requires a different strategy, and getting to a place for these device manufacturers where they have a high confidence update mechanism allows them not just to deliver the most critical security updates, which, by the way, at this point, for a lot of devices, they can barely justify shipping security updates, let alone functional updates or updates for security issues that might not be critical, but maybe just critical but not yet actively being exploited by organized crime. You can get to the place where they can deliver the security updates that they want to deliver with confidence that device is going to come back up. That's a pretty big threshold. And then once you've got update in place, then it's easier to deliver a lot of other security work and change over time to meet the changing needs for that device in terms of their security requirements. So getting to a place where these device manufacturers have an update mechanism that they can have a high degree of confidence in, that's the first priority. And that's the thing that we're delivering at our company, Thistle Technologies, first. But the set of security requirements, the set of security sensitive technologies that are both hard to do right and easy to do wrong is significant. So we are trying to create a platform that allows folks to incorporate the security technologies that they need in their platform, so they don't have to develop the expertise in-house to deliver the same degree of resilience that their customers expect, that their users expect, that the changing needs of the threat environment really requires.
Tell me, so one of the things that kind of jumps out at me in your comments is that it's not just a development process, almost the business model of how you maintain these devices needs to change a little bit. And since the last time we talked, back then security companies were a thing, but you didn't see these kind of eye-popping valuations in the security sector, in software security, at least for sure. Now, I mean, Sneak just $540 million raised on an $8.5 billion valuation. The Biden administration's executive order, the recent White House meeting. Like, how has the business and to follow on that, the regulatory environment changed, and how's that impacting the kind of work you're doing?
Well, the temperature has definitely been turned up. A lot of folks are seeing regulatory pressure to deliver updates to get to a place where they have a better security story for both their customers, for regulatory purposes. I don't think that this is a field that has ever felt, let's say, folks pull back. I think the entire 25 years that I've been in security has been a growing recognition of just how big the problem is, how vulnerable we are, how much work we need to do in order to meet the requirements that we have for these devices, for these systems, for these OSs. And it's just, it increases over time, and I haven't seen any sort of pullback. But our threats are also getting more sophisticated. Our deployments are getting more complex. The number of technologies that we incorporate into any one technology product grows and grows. And even though you incorporate, let's say, a library from this one provider into your technology product, they may also be incorporating multiple libraries from different providers. And the set of technologies that we rely on that all need to get to the same level of security resilience that you have for that one product, it creates a problem of complexity that is really difficult as a CISO, as a CSO, to get your arms around. And if you are that technology provider, get into a place where you understand the security implications of all these different components, it's incredibly difficult.
It's just such a daunting challenge of like the business model, the regulatory environment, the legacy of all the stuff that we have out there. Pretend you're talking to just someone who doesn't know a ton about security, maybe not a software or technology developer. Seems like we witness a lot of attack vectors that are like crappy passwords. IoT is such a good example of this, where the default admin password and username just seems to constantly come up. Like, what are the most simple things that people can do for the most simple attack vectors that are hitting us right now?
Sure. The things that have worked in security from the earliest days with general purpose operating systems are the same things that we bring into the future, and they are things that have consistently worked across the board. So if you are a developer on one of these products, reducing the attack surface, that means reducing the number of entry points into your system. And for those entry points, doing a high degree of sanitization on input. It's about compartmentalization, making sure that the compromise of one component isn't a compromise of everything. It's secure storage of secrets. It's secure communications, leveraging encrypted communications and storing secrets encrypted. But I think the most significant improvement we can make is migrating to memory-safe languages for especially sensitive components that might be accepting network input or input from untrusted sources. So getting to a place where you have a high degree of confidence that memory corruption issues are greatly reduced because you're using a memory-safe language, that's a huge leap forward in terms of the resilience of your product. So that's a thing that you guys can advocate for in your own environments, moving to memory-safe languages.
Is this the Mozilla background coming up? Rust? Are you like, I
Rust
see
is a great option.
I
Rust
agree.
Is fantastic, yeah. But it's not just Rust. Like even if it's choosing a higher level language over a low level language. If you have to do your own memory management, memory allocation, then you can also make mistakes that lead to memory corruption issues. And if you're using a higher level language, even if it's Java, right, memory allocation is out of the responsibility of the developer, which means that you're greatly reducing the opportunity for memory corruption issues.
Yeah, Josh Oss, who runs the Let's Encrypt project,
Yeah.
We had a staff meeting the other day, and he gave the best speech I've ever seen him give in his life. There's maybe 20 people in the room, but he's like, just for once and for all, we just have to rewrite this stuff in Rust. He sort of, he mentioned the kernel, he mentioned TLS libraries, like, where would you start in that? Like, he has his opinions.
I would start with TLS, which is where they've made a huge contribution in terms of Russell's.
Yeah.
But anything that is network facing, anything that is accepting untrusted input, that's a great opportunity to move to Rust or some other memory safe language, because that is the area of highest risk in your system.
What would you tell an open source project? Like Kubernetes, they have their own security SIG and, pretty sophisticated in terms of their view on secure coding practices. They have the resources to go underwrite third-party audits. But what would you tell, just a typical open source project? Like, what can they do to improve their security baseline?
Well, the first thing they can do is move to a memory safe language. And then the next thing they can do is be ruthless with delete. Getting rid of code that is not in the critical path for most of your customers and making that a module that they can incorporate, or something that is not deployed by default, means that the security vulnerabilities you identify in those components in the future aren't going to impact the deployments that are out there now. And getting to a place where you have the smallest possible default deployment means that you have the smallest possible attack surface. So that's an architecture decision. That's a whiteboard decision. This is not does not require a huge amount of security knowledge in your organization in order to be able to have this conversation, in order to be able to incorporate this into future refactoring that you might be doing. But a default deployment with the smallest set of functionality that services your customer base or how folks are going to use it, and let folks choose the modules that are most appropriate for their use cases. I remember I had to fight tooth and nail to get Gopher removed from the Mozilla web browser. And the number of people who were using Gopher at that time was like 3. But
the University of Minnesota strikes again.
But that's a lot of code. That's a lot of code with a lot of parsing that it's doing. So it's a high risk component that everybody was exposed to. I mean, so I'm really glad that we won that fight. But for your own projects, look through them and say, here's a feature that 3% of your user base really loves, but it's 3% of your user base, and should you expose the other 97% to the vulnerabilities that may be present in that, or can those folks just download it as a modulo and get the functionality they need without giving the rest of the deployment all of that exposure?
So yeah, I don't know if you saw earlier, I had that diagram that sort of from develop and repository to build environment and dependencies and so forth to the customer. And all the different attack vectors. You see these people taking over NPM package, either namespaces or just outright taking over abandoned packages and inserting vulnerabilities in the supply chain that way, or unsigned packages and so forth. If you could wave your magic wand, and now I'm kind of getting free advice from you here, and change any of those components, what would your top 3 or 4 things be across the technology supply chain where you'd say, boy, if we could all collectively do these things, what would those be?
I'd say getting to a high degree of confidence in terms of validation that the package you're downloading is coming from the place that you expect it to come from. And then for devices specifically, making sure that there's a way to confirm that the device, the what's running on the device is actually what you expect to be running on the device. Because one of the problems that we're having in device security is that you can't validate that what's on the device is actually what you think is supposed to be on the device. So rootkits live forever because it's hard to, a lot of these devices are uninspectable for the administration for that device. It's a handful of configuration options, but not a lot of ways to evaluate what's going on in memory and whether or not if it's behaving strangely, if it's sending out requests to who knows where. There's not a lot of ability to inspect what's happening on these devices. So both creating the mechanisms for inspection and then also creating for these packages a better way to validate that it's coming from who we think it is, and that in memory it is executing what we expect and not extra stuff.
Yeah, so reproducibility, package signing, I mean, those seem like no-brainers. But
those are all specific ways to deliver on this, but there are a number of ways that we can deliver it. And like in closed spaces, they have their strategies. In open spaces, we've got to change our approach. But being able to, with a high degree of confidence, say that this is the package that we're expecting and that it's validated all the way down, especially if it's changing low-level components. That's a huge critical component.
I still come back to, I mean, of course, that sounds so sane, right? But I come back to the business model question, the first thing you said, which is an IoT device manufacturer tends to say, I'm done here, I've sold the device, I can't afford to underwrite that kind of more sophisticated update mechanism and supply chain effort. Are we going to see changes where IoT manufacturers and device makers need to, we're already seeing sort of this subscription model. Are we going to see more of that?
So this is kind of, you're singing my song here. I've got a carrot and a stick, and I don't really like to talk about the stick because I, as a CISO, as a CSO, I feel resistant to folks who try and talk about security with fear. And the carrot here is actually very appealing to me. If the relationship with the customer ends once you sell the device, and they are looking at a company like Tesla who gets to sell features as an update after the device walks out the door, they're all looking at that and saying, how do I get there? And the way you get there is through an update mechanism that has a high degree of confidence that is reliable, because it's not just about delivering security updates or functional updates. You can deliver new features this way. And so that's the carrot for them, and it's for a lot of businesses easier to justify spending money on something that can generate revenue than it is to spend money on something that is going to build a more resilient foundation for your product, which is compelling, and no one's ever going to say that they don't want a resilient foundation for their product. But if you look at how people spend money, then or how these companies allocate their funds, then revenue generation is of course going to be king. So being able to tie both a more resilient security implementation with the opportunity for a new revenue stream for a lot of these device manufacturers, that is how I'm hoping to bring those two things together, and for a lot of companies, enable them to justify getting security on board, because it's enabling a new revenue opportunity as well.
Do you think that, let's pivot to the fear side for a second, the threat of regulatory action or a consumer awareness that they want to pay for security, so to speak, which do you think is going to be near term, long term? Do you think either of those things are going to happen?
I think the regulatory requirements are required, that we have to go there as an industry. But I also think they're mostly check boxes for a lot of companies, that they might implement the mechanism that meets the requirement, like the lowest investment that will meet the requirement. And very often it doesn't meet the reason for the requirement. It doesn't actually mitigate the threat that the regulation is intended to address. So while I think we need regulatory requirements, I think it's unfair to the consumer who buys this device that it's going to be useless in 2 years because the device manufacturer decided not to ship an update for it. And it's not just the device manufacturer, it might be that system on a chip that has a vulnerability in it, that's a component incorporated into this technology that you bought. Maybe it's now a phone. The device manufacturer isn't shipping an update because the system on a chip manufacturer didn't ship an update, and there's a massive security vulnerability with an exploit available out in the wild that organized crime is actively taking advantage of. And now that device is, you don't trust it, you can't use it, which contributes to our e-waste and makes devices useless before their time. This is a device that would otherwise be perfectly useful, and in this case, it's not because of a security vulnerability or an unwillingness to update. So I think it can extend the life of devices. I think it can improve our how we leverage these, and I think for these a lot of these devices, that making it easier to update is a part of it. We have to make the update also more palatable to the industry, because for these devices, even a 1% failure rate is so incredibly painful for them. It's so costly for them and for their customers that I see both sides of it. I understand why there's resistance here. And I think the regulatory aspect is going to drive the need to do something.
Yeah.
But without making it easy for them, without an opportunity here that they're looking to take advantage of, a lot of companies might try and meet the requirement as easily as possible, which might not actually deliver the resilience that they really need.
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the executive order mention of ways to, trace software across the supply chain, package, version number, software bill of materials effort. We obviously have the SPDX effort, which is now an international standard. How can we all work together to sort of have a collective conscious of hey, be aware of what you have in your software? We recently did a survey on software bill of materials readiness, and I was really surprised at the degree to which people said, I'm aware, and we're already starting to plan for implementing software bill of materials tracing throughout the ecosystem. Like, how important do you think that aspect of, just even having situational awareness is?
I think it's hugely important. As a CSO, going through our technology stacks and looking for all the different technologies that we incorporate was critical to understanding whether or not a vulnerability that was recognized in, let's say, an open source library that might have been incorporated not just into our product, but maybe into products that we deploy for our corporate security or infrastructure components that our cloud vendors might be using. It might be impacting us in a lot of different parts of the organization. So understanding within our product all the different things that we incorporate was important for licensing purposes. It was important for being able to say that we have done this degree of completeness with code analysis in terms of code that was older, that was maybe hadn't had someone assess it in a long time in terms of security resilience. Mm-hmm. If we're incorporating a library that hasn't had an update in years, that might be an area that we feel is exposed. Is there a way for us to isolate it a little bit more? Is there a way for us to compartmentalize that component a bit better so that we weren't exposed to vulnerability? And these are massive code bases. So getting to the place where you can say, we evaluated all this code. I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon. It's not, even automation only identifies code constructs that may result in vulnerabilities. And if you were to spend all your time touching all those code constructs to make sure that they don't fit the construct that the tool is looking for, you might introduce new vulnerabilities. You definitely introduce instability. Nothing's ever simple. None of this comes for free. So even the tools that we use to potentially identify whether there's vulnerability in the code base doesn't give us as much value as even just saying, it's a module now, right? A set of folks who are using it is going to be small, and we can protect the ecosystem by reducing the impact of any particular vulnerability over there. And those kinds of strategies are easier for organizations without a significant security organization. They can still easily deploy those kinds of those solutions to high impact, because if the code's not deployed, then you're not vulnerable. And getting to that place is a much higher degree of confidence in terms of your assertion than saying, yeah, we ran some tools on it, and so we're good. We don't even know that having run the tools on it that we don't have vulnerabilities there. We just know that the code constructs that this tool looks for are either not present or they've been addressed. It's move to a high level language. That would be, just do that.
And it all comes back.
Yeah.
Well, let's give some comments to the open source developers that are out there. Eric Brewer from Google and I had a conversation the other day, and he said, we're actually pretty good at finding bugs. We're just not good at fixing them. There's just not enough people, there's not enough time. And the bad guys come in and they can exploit those vulnerabilities. What is your sense in this race between everyone now sort of in a bigger sense of urgency trying to improve the cybersecurity baseline across that supply chain versus how good the bad guys are getting at exploiting these weaknesses? Like where it just in your circles, like where is that race right now?
So it's harder for the bad guys than it was before, but the bad guys are better than they were before. So they're more sophisticated, there are better tools available to them, just like I say them as if they're not us, like the security space is, let's call it offense and defense, right? Instead of like the bad guys, like the bad guys are the ones who take advantage of the vulnerabilities and then exploit them for their own purposes, as opposed to the set of folks who are looking for vulnerabilities. And the set of people who are looking for vulnerabilities are really good at finding vulnerabilities, and they are widespread and they are significant. And it's talk at the dinner table at my house. Because it's there, there's more, it's just, oh my gosh, how does that even exist in 2021? And I feel like I've had this conversation many times in 2021. So it's, they are insidious and pervasive and just so widespread. I don't know that we're going to get to a place where we don't have the kind of complexity that will eventually result in security vulnerabilities. Even in new code, we still manage to introduce new vulnerabilities. So the strategies that have always worked are going to be the strategies that get us out of this space, where we compartmentalize, we reduce our attack surface, we move to higher level languages, which is reduction of attack surface. Like those are the ways that we're going to get to a place where we have a higher degree of confidence in the code that we run. It's easier to have a higher degree of confidence in something that is smaller, something that is less complex, something that is reduced in scope. So yes, they are always going to be, the attacker's always successful because they can just wait for the opportunity where there's a technology that you depend on, and the set of technologies that you depend on grows every year. And all the technologies that you incorporate, maybe you think you have 5, but you really have 50 because they each incorporate 10, and then each of those incorporate many more, and so it's not even really 50, it's 500. We are, our interdependencies on all these different technologies grow over time in every environment. So the attacker will always have many opportunities. So our strategy needs to be reducing our attack surface, high degree of compartmentalization, moving to these higher level languages, and reducing our default deployments so that folks don't have extra attack surface in their environments.
All right, I want to end on one question, which is a metaphor, now and then let's say 3 to 5 years from now. Is from an attacker's perspective, the door wide open? Is there kind of a janky lock on the door? Is there a security system installed? Like, where are we at in the baseline? Is it, does it require state actors, super sophisticated tools to get in, or is it pretty much like, hey, anybody can come on in? Where are we at now? Where do you think we can get?
It depends. Some technology vendors have made a huge investment and have deployed these kinds of strategies that I've described, and it's harder. But again, you can just be opportunistic as an attacker. So it's hard today, but maybe tomorrow you have an opportunity. For some places, the door is wide open. They haven't even given security a thought, and they're operating like it's the late 90s in terms of their security implementations in some of these devices. So it really just depends on what we're talking about. There's some companies that just woke up and realized that they're technology companies. Like they thought they were manufacturing washing machines and refrigerators, but they all have computers now, and they're all sitting on the network. And oh wow, those actually need to have a security story as well. So I think eventually all of the companies will wake up and realize that they're all technology companies, and they all need to apply the same sort of security sensitivity to the technology they're putting out into the world. I wouldn't say there's a baseline that's consistent across the industry. I would say that in the devices space, they are very much behind the general purpose operating system space for a number of reasons that are perfectly legitimate, but this is where we are today. So we need to hurry up and get to a place of security resilience.
Sounds like a business opportunity.
Yeah.
Thistle is hiring, I hear.
Yes, we are. We're looking for embedded device engineers. We are looking for a UX engineer. We are definitely hiring.
Well, I know you're still in early stages, and I look forward to the day when you are coming to market with these kind of solutions. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
All right, let's give her a hand. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it. We have a break now. Sessions begin at 11:15. For those of you who want to participate in some of the virtual sessions, you can head to our virtual learning labs, and we will see you back here tomorrow with Linus Torvalds. Have a great day.
Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, I walk around the neighborhood. Feeling blessed, never stressed. Got that sunshine on my Sunday best. Hey, some days you wake up and nothing works, you feel surrounded. Gotta give your feet some gravity to get you grounded. Keep good things inside your ears just like the waves and sound it. And just say whatever, cause there is no way you're grounded. Everyone falls down sometime, but you just gotta know it'll all be fine. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, I walk around the neighborhood. Feeling blessed, never stressed. Got that sunshine on my Sunday best. Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, I walk around the neighborhood. Feeling blessed, never stressed. Got that sunshine